Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Jessica Taylor is assistant professor in the history department at Virginia Tech. As a public historian, she collaborates on projects across the Southeast as diverse as oral histories with boat builders, augmented reality tours of historic sites, and reconstructed maps of pre-colonial landscapes. Her current work connects graduate and undergraduate students to history firsthand through fieldwork experiences and oral history, and an ongoing project documenting the escape attempts of indentured servants and enslaved people in the 17th century Chesapeake. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor.
Can everyone hear me okay? Is that all right? Thank you for the thumbs up. Thank you again for having me. I teach at Virginia Tech, as I already said, and I was always jealous when my coworkers would say I'm researching at the Filson next weekend or whatever. And I was so jealous because it sounded so awesome. And now I can say that it is. I'm going to talk today about my book, which comes out this month. I'm very proud of it, but I also want to introduce myself and kind of where this situates in my own career. So I'm a historian, but first and foremost, I'm actually an oral and public historian. I sit down with people of all walks of life and talk about their lives, primarily in Eastern Virginia, although I've done the same in Nantucket, in Appalachia, and in the Southeast, like Alabama and Florida, with Indigenous people, with watermen, like one of my favorites here. And one of the things that really I love about talking to people about generational wisdom, particularly in Eastern Virginia, people who, have spent 70, 80, 90 years on the water, on the Chesapeake Bay, is that a single county in Eastern Virginia can have hundreds of miles of coastline. And people in Eastern Virginia, people who, this is a crabber, people who fish, are some of the only people that know those little guts and ditches, know their names, know the folklore around them. And it made me realize that so much of history over the past 100, 200, 300 years in the Southeast is experienced locally, is experienced by the individual, by family members. And that really does inform my work in this colonial context, which is quite different, even though in talking to a lot of you, I realized that oftentimes we're talking about the same families between the 1600s and 1700s in Virginia and in the 2010s, 2020s in Kentucky. I also, in doing public history and oral history, I work with a lot of archaeologists, and we put together National Register nominations and things like that. And I realized through them, because they sort of excavate from the ground all the way down to subsoil, which predates human occupation, that human history is deposited in layers. And in Eastern Virginia, you excavate through VHS tapes in the 1980s, and then you get down to World War II artifacts, and then you get down to Civil War buttons, and then you get down to colonial history, and then at the very bottom, before you get to subsoil, is Indigenous occupation and native land. And that has also really informed how I think about history. So in this early period, I start with the modern period, because I want my students and I want people I talk to understand that this was native land before it was anything else. And a lot of colonial history sits on top of native history. And if you dig deep enough, you can find the native in the modern and the 2020s in pre-colonial history. So this is a map that I and colleagues at Virginia Tech have been working on, and I wanted to zoom out a little bit so that maybe you could see places that might be familiar to you. And I asked the students to look at it because they're used to thinking about Indigenous history as Native people sort of traipsing through the woods, kind of like the Pocahontas Disney story. And I asked them to tell me what they see, if they see anything familiar. And eventually some student in the back will say 81. I see Highway 81. And they're right. That was an Indigenous road before contact. They also see Roanoke, Virginia. They see Salem, Virginia, where some of them might be from. And those were Indigenous towns before they were colonial towns. And so the past and the present really intermingle a lot more than we think. So that comes down to the way that colonialism actually works. And my central argument here addresses the question of what happens when colonists encounter Native networks, as well as Native cultures and Native societies. And this was sort of my way to try to explain a lot of the violence that happened during the colonial period, but also to make sense of the ways in which Indigenous people survived the colonial period, despite the odds stacked against them, especially in the second half of the 17th century. And what I came down to is that Indigenous people had power disproportionate to their numbers because they were able to keep networks alive and they were able to keep knowledge of the Chesapeake alive. And that allowed them to sort of ignore a lot of the colonial boundaries that were being put in place during the colonial administration of even the most energetic Virginian governors like Sir William Berkeley. And then on the Virginian side of things, elites were not doing the colonial government in a lot of cases any favors. They were also transgressing a lot of colonial boundaries. And meanwhile, non-elites, people who were in bondage, people who were in debt, people who just did not share the wealth that was being generated by the tobacco economy, also were uninterested in supporting the colonial project and oftentimes ran away to Maryland, to the Carolinas, even to the Dutch and the Swedes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But all of that did not help the stability of the early colonial period. And that leads us to iconic conflicts like Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. So just like we wouldn't expect that English colonial subjects were united as one. English colonial subjects, as you all know, we talked about Maryland a little bit before this started, were divided by religion, they were divided by class, they were divided by political differences, and they were also divided by personal ambition. The same is true for Indigenous people. So the Algonquians, that's the group of people who dominated the Chesapeake during this time period. That's the language that most people spoke in the Chesapeake, were recently consolidated under a chief or a werowance, which is the name for chief. For women, it's Werowance-squaw, who consolidated authority over 30-something districts across the Chesapeake, which amounted to tens of thousands of people. It was a very recent, but also very powerful military complex, social complex, cultural complex during this time period. And that starts to take place in the late 1500s. So right before John Smith and all his friends show up at Jamestown in 1607. The chief of the Powhatan chiefdom, which most people know that as Pocahontas's dad, his real name was Wahun Seneca, and he was the, quote, paramount chief or the werowance for all of these tens of thousands of people that lived in the Chesapeake. And there were some people that didn't join the chiefdom, but for the most part, he was able to, through force, but also through trade and through diplomacy, consolidate power to make sure that the Chesapeake remained in Algonquian control. The result was a group of people that lived in kind of common ways, and ways that would actually, if you look at this list, really resonate with English people. People who are very accustomed to being on the water every day. Most people lived a 2-minute walk away from the water. in the Algonquian world. They were very well networked. So we know that copper, which was a precious metal for the Algonquians, actually came from the Great Lakes region, all the way to what is now Virginia, through Powhatan networks. John Smith also noticed that the Powhatans had actually gathered European goods that they had acquired before 1607, probably from the Spanish, probably from the Gulf of Mexico. So these are people with a truly continental, very powerful set of communication lines. So when John Smith comes with lots of other people like Lord Delaware and John West and that set of families who were very adept at military conquest. They had taken part in conquests in Ireland and the Netherlands, and they set out to map and survey the Powhatan chiefdom. They ended up smack dab in the center of that Powhatan chiefdom, and you'll see Jamestown is outlined on the left, and where Wicomico, which is the capital of the Powhatan chiefdom, is on the York River, what's now known as the York River today. So John Smith John Smith and his friends began to trade with the Algonquians, with the Powhatan chiefdom, as soon as they arrived, in order to make more money. And that's one of the major themes that we'll see again and again, is a reliance on Powhatan food and Powhatan trade from those very, very early years. The English, however, because these were military men, and because they didn't really respect the Algonquians as much as they could have, were not particularly respectful of what the Powhatans considered to be reciprocal relationships. It could be partially communication, but the Powhatans, this was during a period of drought when John Smith arrived, were irritated and ultimately ended up breaking communication lines just a few years into the foundation of Jamestown. And the result was that even though this was a period of environmental drought that lasted for years, even though everybody was hungry, the colonists starved, and the Powhatan chiefdom districts survived and thrived. And the reason is that Indigenous people still controlled the networks, still controlled knowledge of the area, and were able to cut off the English from trading with anybody, whether or not they were under control of Wahun Seneca. And that resulted in the iconic starving time at Jamestown in 1609. So the English response is to try to gain control over these communication networks, because they understood that was where a lot of that power came from. So they set out to map these communication networks. They set out to find divisions inside of the Powhatan chiefdom to try to trade with one group and not another, things like that. And that started sort of a war of intelligence in these early years. So the Powhatans fought back as the English tried to expand the tobacco economy, expand trade up the rivers past Algonquin control. Historians theorize a lot of different things about whether or not the Powhatans intended to kill John Smith and the other Englishmen in those early years, wipe them off the face of the map. But the truth is that they offered a lot to the Powhatans. They offered trade goods. They seemed like they could be a powerful ally. But in 1622, there was a new leader that replaced Wahun Seneca, his brother, who in the course of a few hours on an April morning in 1622, wiped out a quarter of the Virginia population. All basically a coordinated attack up and down the James River that had been probably planned for months. And the reason that was why the Powhatans were able to make that happen is because Algonquians had been in the homes of Englishmen every day, had been trading with them every day. So this English dependence on the Algonquians over time, on on the food that they provided, on the trade, even on their labor, was actually part of the reason for the devastation that followed. So not only did a quarter of the colonists die, but the reputation of the Virginia Company, which founded Virginia, was ruined. The company dissolved in 1624. It also completely collapsed the economy and separated Virginian settlements from one another and shrunk the footprint of the English for years. There we go. So over decades, this sort of kind of warfare that was really brutal shaped both societies. The English, because again, they had sort of had a practice run in Ireland and the Netherlands, practiced what they called feed fights, which sounds like it's cafeteria sort of a kind of thing. But what they would do is wait for women's cornfields to be ready to harvest, Algonquian women's cornfields, and then go and burn them or go and take all of their food and leave them to essentially like forage for themselves in the woods for the rest of the season. So in this 10-year period, Algonquians and the English fought one another. But what resulted on the English side was actually people who were trading with Indigenous people and then raiding Indigenous people became very wealthy. One of the historians that I've cited in here, James Rice, suggests that the majority of the labor pool during this period was owned by 12 men, just 12 men. And this is before even Maryland existed. So during this time period, there's actually a consolidation of power, both on the part of the English, and then the Powhatans are just responding to that and coming underneath Opechancanough, his Powhatan's brother. So Opechancanough ultimately is captured in 1646, which you can see he's actually in his 90s when that happens. The story is that someone he was carried on a chair into battle, and someone had to hold open his eyelids. During that time period. And then he was shot in the back by a soldier once he was captured. And that is sort of the end of the Powhatan chiefdom as the English first knew it. But my thought here is that even though these are the parameters of the new relationship between English people and Native people in Virginia, that their power continues to last. So in 1646, the remaining Powhatan groups took tributary status, which means that they pay tribute to the governor, who was Governor William Barclay at that time. In case any of you, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but Indigenous nations in Virginia still pay tribute to the governor today in the form of deer, usually around Thanksgiving. The governor always looks very uncomfortable with it, actually. But here were the new rules that Governor Barclay set out, and it's basically a total separation. He understood that Indigenous people who were traveling through English settlements, making a habit of it, creating that intimacy, crossing those boundaries, that was the threat. So what he tried to do was say, you cannot come within a certain number of miles of an English settlement or you will be shot. You have to carry a badge. It will be a badge later. You have to carry a certain color of coat in order to come into our settlements, or you will be shot. And that actually was the case. People were killed for coming near English settlements, even to trade, with their longtime trading partners. But the problem is that English people and Indigenous people over time really do start to ignore that, especially as English people start to come north of the York River into huge swaths of former Indigenous territory. So in the 1650s, there's an enormous land push. These people that had basically laid claims to thousands of acres at a time were gathering up land in what's now the Middle Peninsula, and then north of that. And that comes at the same time that an increasing number of indentured servants and enslaved people are also coming into the colony. And some of that does include Indigenous people as well. My students are really surprised to hear that. There's one historian conjectures that around 50,000 Indigenous people were enslaved by the 18th century. And Charleston, South Carolina was actually supposedly exporting more people than they were importing for a while there. So I just wanted to plug that as well, that this isn't, there's a lot of different kinds of ways that this occurred in the 17th century. So this is what the settled area kind of looked like during this time period. And this is also sort of conjectural and shows English control where it wasn't total. And in fact, what was happening, and archaeology also kind of proves this, is that Indigenous people and English people sort of lived in more of a checkerboard pattern, that Indigenous people and Virginian English colonists lived sort of next to each other. In fact, English people started to take over very consciously native land by saying they would look in the woods, for example, for Indigenous cabins or women's fields, and they would say, that is where I want to settle, because they know that it's good agricultural land because the women had already farmed it. Or they saw that it was already cleared and said, that's a great place to start. So over time, English people are consciously taking over areas where Indigenous towns had been, and that pushes Indigenous people back into sort of the interiors of those peninsulas. And here's a good example of that. This is a map by a Dutch mariner named Augustine Herman, and you can see some of the Indigenous towns that are in what is still sort of swampy area. But just because those Indigenous towns are right there doesn't mean there aren't other ones on the interiors of those peninsulas as well. That's just what he knew because that's where he traded. Let's see. So over time, what we see is that Indigenous people, Algonquians, start to take part in Virginian politics in a very ordinary way, both at the local level, but also at the Commonwealth level. This is from the Treaty of Middle Plantation, which is the last official treaty that still is in effect today, from 1677 to 1680. But I argue that these sorts of checkerboard patterns, but also the ways that English people responded to them, created large problems. So first, I take Bacon's Rebellion, which, in case you're unfamiliar with Bacon's Rebellion, it was started by a couple of very local conflicts. So first, some Susquehannocks, so that's people that aren't from Virginia, Native people were killed by colonists, and then started to retaliate during the Susquehannock War, which is in the 1670s, and that caused a lot of fear among the colonists that these Native people that they didn't know were going to start coming into the colony. And William Barclay, who's now in his third decade of being governor, starts to put money towards fortifications and patrols and things like that, upsetting taxpayers. And at the same time, Nathaniel Bacon has a servant, indentured servant, who is killed by some kind of native invader, probably Susquehannocks. And that sort of devolves into a situation in which Nathaniel Bacon, other landowners, Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy person who had trained as a lawyer and come to Virginia to seek his fortune. Other landowners, indentured servants, enslaved people, all of these people got together and ran roughshod all over Virginia and all over Indigenous land. So they burned Jamestown to the ground. They also burned Indigenous forts and towns. They took people as captives, probably to sell them. And also raided all kinds of plantations. And by the time it was over, the British, or the English at the time, had sent over basically an army to put down what they saw as a threat to royal authority. And over time, historians have been really fascinated by this moment. And Edmund Morgan, who's one of the most famous historians of the 20th century, argues that this is the moment because it was a combination of Black and white people that defined the association between whiteness and freedom and Blackness and slavery. He made that argument in 1976. And I don't take issue with that argument. I take issue with I want to qualify that with a argument about the strategy here, and say that over the course of the 17th century, so from the 1620s onward, people were doing this kind of thing, exactly what Bacon did on Indigenous land. So one of my favorite examples of this is on Kent Island. Does anyone know where Kent Island is? Where is it? What state? Maryland. Well, according to Virginians, it's in Virginia. And that's exactly what causes a problem. So William Claiborne, who made a lot of money and accrued a lot of wealth from trading and raiding during the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, decided that he would put a trading outpost so far up in Maryland that it's practically Delaware. And instead, Marylanders got upset and started to come after him, trying to take those native networks for themselves. So one of the things that William Claiborne and other traders do is they dispense rumors everywhere that become impossible for colonial authorities to control. So they'll say the Spanish are on their way, or this other trader is going to cause an Indian rebellion, or this government is going to invade this other government. So they were making all these rumors that the people at the cores of Jamestown and St. Mary's City had no way to control. And that undermined colonial authority. And that leads to the second way that there's a major problem with how Virginians interacted with Native networks, which is that those rumors and just individual ambitions bred violence. So if Claiborne says that the Marylanders are coming to kill Indigenous people, those Indigenous people are going to respond, right? And eventually the Virginians and Marylanders are going to go to war at sea over Kent Island, and people are going to be killed. The same thing's true of one of my other favorite men, Edmund Scarborough, who was the surveyor general for the colony of Virginia, probably the wealthiest man in the colony during that time period, who decided to say that Indigenous people are going to attack us, so we're going to attack them first. And he went into Maryland and told the people in Maryland that they were now in Virginia and took over that land, at least temporarily. And he did that multiple times, even though he was explicitly told not to invade another colony. And that's the kind of ways in which people are using rumor, but also the real threat of Indigenous people and their power to further their own ends. He was a landowner right next to, not right next to, but nearby where that border was on the Eastern Shore. Lastly, and this is a really big one, these encounters are frequent and they're unnecessary. Everyone sees that they're unnecessary, but they're also expensive. So when Edmund Scarborough or someone else goes up against Indigenous people in a conflict that he maybe shouldn't have started, what ends up happening is other people have to pay for that. And that happens over decades and decades and decades. And Bacon's rebellion in the 1660s and 1670s, there's economic downturns. There's a lot of fear going around already. And then when Berkeley says, we're going to put money towards forts, put money towards patrols, taxpayers are upset because they've been dealing with this for a long time, but now they're dealing with it acutely. I think that these reasons need to be added to our understanding of what Bacon's rebellion is, because as a strategy, what Bacon does, which is go against Indigenous people saying that they're a threat, is actually a very old-fashioned strategy by this point. So now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the project that I'm working on now. So just to give you a little bit of background, I started to look at how non-elites, so people that are in bonded labor, people that are tenants or are just not wealthy, how they were harnessing Native networks differently. And that includes Indigenous people themselves that show up in court records and things like that. And someone told me at a conference when I essentially presented a big Excel sheet that showed all the people who had run away from bonded labor or who had rebelled, that I should drop my book and I should do that instead. And I didn't do that because I need to write a book to keep my job. But him saying that always lived in the back of my head. And so this year I got together some friends from Virginia State University and from our libraries and from Library of Virginia. And we're going to try to make a database of people who ran away from servitude, enslavement, other forms of bonded labor. And I just want to give you a little bit of background on that because it launches just this month. The labor system as it existed during this early period, a lot of people don't know that it was really more complicated than just slavery and freedom. There were indentured servants who were paid, people paid for their passage to bring them over here. But there were also people who were in an in-between kind of state that had maybe no legal status, or their legal status was contested in different places. And that did allow plantation owners to oppress people that were sort of squeezed in that middle area, that no one really knew if they were enslaved or indentured or for how long, or what their status was. So these people are a lot more complicated than also my students realize. So there are people who are educated that end up in indentured servitude. There's people who are very poor, a lot of children, but also people from the Dutch states, from Ireland who don't speak English, but also from different parts of Africa, the Caribbean, people who had been indigenous inside of the continent, people who had been part of Algonquian families and maybe were captured during the wars. The most important way that we know about these people is through their head right system. So the way that works is people were incentivized to bring labor over by being given 50 acres per person. And then those names, whoever paid for their passage, were put into a logbook, which is what you see here. So this person is getting 1,850 acres of land for bringing over these people. And we see them in court records when maybe they do something illegal. And that's the exact place that I want to start to study. I also want people to understand that these are skilled people, and that these are people who, even if they, come to Virginia at the age of 5 and they only speak Dutch, they grow networks over time. They grow skills over time, just like anyone does. You make friends that have things that you do not have. You make trades. All of these kinds of things show up from the very beginning of the Virginia Company in 1607, all the way till the end of the 17th century. And I love to tell different stories from this time period, but Constantine Monaghan is a really good example of this. So Kent Island in Maryland/Virginia was under the control of William Claiborne for a while, and one of his servants, which we're assuming is indigenous because of the way the records are worded, was supposed to go to Kent Island for a trade with the Susquehannocks, who come down where you can see up there where they're labeled at the top of the map, and meet at this place that they gifted Claiborne. They're allies of Claiborne. And so Constantine says, yes, I'll do that, but I'll also take a little side job and just kind of stop by some of these other planters, and you see those on the eastern shore there, and make a little money for myself. And so he's accused of basically taking on a contract that wasn't his to take on because he's not a free person. And the problem is that he already has these networks in place. He probably succeeds in taking on these extra jobs in 1644, so much so that when he comes back and is taken to court, no one can prove that he did anything illegal. So that's someone who ran away, but not really. What he's doing is he's taking advantage of those networks that were, first of all, native, but he's taking advantage of his own diplomatic skills, his own connections, and probably Claiborne's connections too, to make a little bit of money. Why do people run away? I think that one's a pretty obvious one. For people that aren't like Constantine, there are lots of reasons. The 17th century in Virginia, the life expectancy was very low. It was a really difficult place to live. But I enjoy reading their accounts as to why they did things, because it shows, even if it is secondhand, so these are people kind of tattling on other people in this case, it shows the kinds of rhetoric that people are using around slavery and freedom, even in this early period. You can see that there's a political nature to the conversation around people that try to escape bonded labor. The other thing that I love is learning about where people were headed and how. So we have this sort of one-dimensional idea about 19th century enslaved people trying to escape via the Underground Railroad, escape to the north, to the free states, and that's sort of where our mind goes. But in the 17th century, the political landscape is completely different. And where people say they are headed is illuminating, because it tells us what they thought was possible. And so here's a young man from the Eastern Shore who stole a boat and said he was going to Venice. This is the only time I'd ever seen it. I don't know how far he might have gotten, but we see other people who, like a pregnant woman that stole a boat and went across the Chesapeake Bay to someone else's plantation and decided to set up camp there. That's incredible. That shows incredible skill and incredible foresight and networking. We also see that because the whole continent is not English, that people have a sense of what the Atlantic world is, that maybe I can learn to speak Dutch or Swedish and I can end up there. And I know that they exist up there because the Dutch come down to Virginia all the time to trade. So we get a sense of what freedom looks like to a lot of different people. So I want to close with a really, my favorite sort of a plot that really spiraled out of control. It's the one that relates to Venice. That's in 1670, and it's towards the end of my book, and tells, I think, a really interesting story about how indentured servants, people in bonded labor, supported one another in this. Over the course of a year, a group of at least 13 unfree people from neighboring plantations on Virginia's eastern shore planned a voyage to the north. The conditions for indentured servants drove them to action. Newly arrived servant Isaac Metcalf remarked that, quote, he never saw any people kept so in the country before, and if he had so long to serve here as some of us had, he would hang himself before he would serve it. Inspired by word of an escape from Pocomoke in recent years, he relayed the success to other servants who shared this story at hearths from plantation to plantation on the eastern shores bay, bordering coast between Deep and Nandua creeks. They reported back that if they planned an escape, servants at each plantation in between the two creeks would come with them. According to Metcalf, a mutual agreement was made among the men to, quote, knock the person on the head who should first reveal it, deepening commitment to the plot and one another. Women like Mary Warren also committed to helping the escapees and worked at cross purposes with planters and the conspirators. Mary herself had no intention to sail, but she prepared regardless. Over several weeks, she made extra amounts of cheese and butter, stashed flour and cloth, and stole the storehouse keys from the planters' bedchambers. The foodstuffs and clothing made longer journeys possible and could help thwart recapture. That the co-conspirators hoarded 14 cheeses and other food probably prepared by women suggests that they relied on broad networks of women as well as men who spread the plot. While storing away provisions, the conspirators and their compatriots stole goods valued at an astounding 13,260 pounds of tobacco. The greater the value of the goods they stole, the greater their chance of success, but also the greater the stakes. Lost goods directly translated to time added to an indenture by the court if they were caught. They probably noted the changes occurring at the assembly, which added a bounty on escaped people at 1,000 pounds of tobacco. Whoop. Did I do that? I did. Can I fix it? Can you fix it? I only have one slide left. It's okay. If not, I just like the map because you can kind of see what people are. Maybe from current slide. Thank you. This encouraged planters to seek redress against servants in court, even if they inflicted corporal punishment at home, which would sink captured escapees further into servitude and debt. An opportune moment for the servants came when one planter traveled to James City and left a sailing boat behind in the creek. Coordinating the perfect time to flee required intimate knowledge of the political and social calendars, as well as the storehouses of Virginia's elites. The crew met up, loaded the vessel, and tried to exit Deep Creek towards the bay, but the wind blew too hard and forced them back to shore. Soon, however, word leaked out about the attempt as planners noticed missing goods, and the conspirators meanwhile tried to control intelligence about the incident. When interrogated, servant John Carter blamed nameless thieves from somewhere beyond the plantation. He said, quote, "Was it not well turned? Let me alone for a scurvy trick anytime." Despite the seriousness of their conspiracy, the servants hid evidence rather than turn on one another because escape still seemed within reach. Members of the group then hatched a plan to, quote, "be loose again for Christmas." They tried to steal Dutch trader Jenkin Price's boat, which he used in the native trade. Thomas Watts suggested they sail to Venice, and there they would live. Their hopes hung on the focal point of any water-based escape plan, a pilot to navigate to freedom in other colonies through broader, unfamiliar waters on the bay. If a pilot in a larger vessel met their little boat propelled by stolen sails or homemade oars, they could get to Maryland or maybe beyond. Visitors, perhaps sailors from beyond the eastern shore, had promised that they could take them away when they returned. According to one servant, the pilot who agreed to take them was Black James, Cornelius, a Dutchman's wife. Black James is difficult to identify. The lack of last name suggests he was not an Englishman. The murky reference to Black James and to wherever he came down from, simultaneously obscure but central to the plot, reflected expansive Atlantic trade that brought servants to Virginia and helped them plan to leave it. The Christmas plot was ultimately aborted while county court officials deposed those suspected of involvement. Before long, indentured servants began to implicate one another in the plot, and Metcalf, accused by his co-conspirators as the leader, protested his innocence and blamed the influence of his fellow servants. His master died in 1670 before Metcalf was freed. I just want to close with what I like to tell students, that this project is just about how people thought of freedom and how native land and places and intelligence informed those ideas. And that's what I have for you today. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate the way that you talked about Native networks and the use of Native place names and Native trade networks by the early Virginian colonizers. And I wonder if we could bridge your work between public history and research and talk about how that's represented in Virginia colonial memory or how that might be taught in Virginia today.
I have a whole research project that I completed on this, the historical memory of Bacon's Rebellion. And I have a little article coming out through Encyclopedia Virginia in about a month on this. What's really interesting is that over time, especially after the Civil War, colonial history sort of went through a transformation in the Virginian mind. And the story really became about people like Nathaniel Bacon and Governor Barclay. And because 1676 is exactly 100 years before 1776, people call him the torchbearer of the Revolution, exactly 100 years before another Virginian, George Washington, had his set of ideas. But what ends up happening is we erase all of those other people that were involved in that conflict and the long series of conflicts before it. In most cases, Powhatan, Pocahontas, Opechancanough, those people dominate the narrative about Indigenous people, and their narrative ends when Opechancanough dies in 1646. It's very difficult for the average Virginian to name an Indigenous person after Pocahontas or Powhatan. But that's not actually the case. And that's kind of what I want to say about this, is that there are lots of Indigenous leaders during the 17th century after that, that still shape politics in the region, if not, into the continent. Does that answer your question? Okay.
If anyone else has any questions, if anyone else has questions, I encourage you to come up to one of the mics and ask your question. We do have one question that has come in through the chat, and that is by Judith Bluer. It says, "It seems the Native people had a lot of power initially. What do you think kept them from consolidating together and driving the invaders out?"
I agree with, and this is a point of contention among historians. I agree that they did not want to. I believe that especially in those early years, if they wanted to, they really could have. And the evidence suggests that Indigenous people in the Southeast had successfully driven colonists out of the area. So the Spanish were in the Chesapeake 20, 30 years before this, 40, maybe even years before this, and were driven out. And I think that they saw utility in keeping the English around, at least initially. And so the attacks that you saw in that map, let me see. Oh my gosh, I have so many slides. The attacks that you see, you'll notice that they don't hit everywhere, right? Where they don't hit includes the places that they were supposed to stay, that were the part of their initial agreement with the Paspaheghs. They were supposed to stay in what was then Paspaheghs territory, and then they, went beyond that. And so they were driven out of places where they were not supposed to be. I think that sort of speaks to this point.
Anybody? Another question that's come in the chat is about your recommended further readings, and some people are interested in following up with those. Is there a place where they could access that list?
Sure. Yeah, you just email me. I'll give it to you. No problem. It's free. My contact info. Well, it's Jessica Taylor at vt.edu. You are welcome to email me there anytime.
Well, yeah, I did just want to ask you to, clarify your comment about it sounded like the Native Americans could have driven them out. And by that, do you mean for a few years, for a decade? I mean, because you're talking about, Native Americans who were in no way united across the continent,
No.
and an onslaught of initially a few hundred, but then ultimately thousands, tens of thousands of settlers that brought with them disease that decimated the Native Americans.
So are you asking?
Well, they could have, ultimately driven them out was what you said, but in my mind, they were fighting a losing battle that is what it is today. A sad history of white decimation of Native American civilizations.
Well, I think that, part of why I want to start and end with modern Indigenous people in the Commonwealth today is that they very much still have a relationship politically and socially with the Commonwealth. Like they are definitely still in Eastern Virginia. And when I say that they could have driven them out, I'm talking about 1622 and perhaps even 1644. And of course, people are, Native Americans are not united across the continent because there are hundreds of different nations that have sovereignty over respective lands. And my point about the continent was that they are connected to trading allies, military allies, other people through these networks that provide them with intelligence and goods and the ability to accrue wealth. So I think, does that clarify? Sure.
Right. If there are no other questions, let's just take a moment to thank Dr. Taylor for her remarks tonight.